If you look at the kind of the map of British cinema, and by map I mean which parts of Britain have had films made in them, you can see that there's obviously a kind of picturesque range. You know, there are the Western Isles of Scotland, there are some parts of Wales, there are some attractive scenic parts of the country that have been used, but there are many parts of the country that have not had that kind of treatment, and certainly the industrial Midlands are the centre of that invisible Britain. It's interesting that I think the film Monty really kind of takes this on the nose and sort of says, right, we're going to make a film about something you didn't think you wanted to see, in a place you didn't think you wanted to see on the screen. British cinema had also discovered in the 1960s the possibilities of actually going out and shooting on location in the Midlands, in the North, and bringing these images of essentially a depressed working class environment onto the screen and giving them a certain allure. Those great films, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, This Sporting Life, Lindsay Anderson, those are films which had an international appeal. I mean, they weren't big box office, but they were widely respected and very, very widely seen, and they became a kind of cornerstone of what British cinema, the reinvention of British cinema, stood for. Cinema and television interact in Britain, and they're really very tangled up. I think television in Britain, at its most ambitious, has wanted to make film series out of really unpromising subject material. And there's a long tradition of that, you know, from Till Death Us Do Part, a working class family arguing in their little huddled terrace house, through to something like the royal family, another working class family arguing around the television. That sort of sense of wanting to make stories out of seemingly very impoverished material, I think is part of the energy that has gone into the full Monty.
Oh, well, that's as queer as folk.
The question of language is a very sore point in British cinema, and indeed British broadcasting, because, you know, there is a thing called BBC English. And I think you have to understand that Britain has been for a long, long time, in a sense, glued together by the institution of broadcasting, of the BBC. And the BBC has tended to create a kind of benchmark about what is, you know, comprehensible language.
Well, all the qualifications are there, obviously, Gerald. And we go back further than I care to remember.
But the BBC's also developed its own form of kind of regionalism. And there's a lot of regional voices on the BBC, but they're carefully selected to be comprehensible to people outside of those regions.
You don't give a toss, you kids. It's different for me.
And I think what the full Monty does is to walk that line very shrewdly between giving you a real sense. I mean, some of the accents aren't perfect, but to outsiders, they sound pretty authentic. And it walks that line very carefully, but it's something which British filmmakers had learned to walk and to use the strangeness of accent as a part of saying, look, this is a slice of life, this is authentic. The new element that came in the 80s was really race, ethnicity. And it's quite marked that some of the most interesting films that come out of the 80s took this basic, you know, picture of working class life and addressed the reality of ethnic difference, of race. Stephen Frear's film, A Beautiful Laundrette, My Beautiful Laundrette, is a very good example of that. So things are beginning to change during the 1980s, and British cinema is beginning to reflect the reality of a multicultural Britain, but also it's a Britain that's been devastated by the legacy of the Thatcher period. And so there's a kind of sense of, you know, a burnt-out society, a place where relations have to be reconstructed from the ground upwards. The major industries have been smashed, coal mining, steel, etc. They've all gone, really, in a big way. And so there's a sense in which we've got to kind of begin again and find new roles, new ways of representing these these experiences. And that's why two of the really major successes of the 90s are precisely the films that pick up on those themes. Brassed Off, Mark Herman's film, which is about the rundown coal industry, and The Full Monty, which is about the rundown steel industry.
People say that the success of The Full Monty encouraged the government, the Blair administration, to think seriously about helping the British film industry a bit more.
Well, certainly the government over the last few years has put in place a number of fiscal measures that have helped raising financing for British films in this country much more painless. A lot of that financing, though, has gone to non-British films. I think that the government is rethinking the focus of that fiscal help in order to concentrate its advantages more on British-grown, British-developed, British-made.
But there aren't many films that you can actually say are British-developed, British-made, British, any more than there are French ones or Italian ones, because everything's co-produced. Now you don't know what nationality a film is half the time, except actors.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because I would say that maybe the English cinema is the one that suffers most in the world from the relationship due to the language, the common language, with the American cinema. I would say that there is still very much a French cinema. There is very much a French cinema which is made by French, with French stars, in French, and seen by French audiences.
There is, but very often it's a co-production.
Well, it can be a co-production, but the language of the
oh yes, of course.
and the spirit remains French, in the same way that there is an Italian cinema, albeit not as successful as the French and the German cinema. I think the English cinema is, in a strange way, of all European cinemas, the poorer one, and the one that suffers most from its relationship with its big cousin across the ocean. Not simply in terms of financing, but in terms of its originality and its integrity. It's very difficult, it continues to be very difficult in England to raise substantial amounts of money for British films. And it's very rare that any form of British film can be made above a certain budget without the intervention, the financial intervention of American money, of Hollywood money. And that automatically creates a dilution, I think, on the whole, of the language of the film, of the spirit of the film, of the originality of the film. It's very, very rare that a film can remain as pure as its original conception when financing comes, yes, from England, but also from Hollywood.
Well, yes.
Our luck with our film was, it was one of the early ones, and the source, the financing source, and very specifically Fox Searchlight and very specifically Lindsay Law, who had, as a career, been dealing with independent cinema on the East Coast when he was at American Playhouse. It was his understanding of what we were trying to make that allowed us very much to stay with the film as close as our dream, as our original intentions could have been, as we could have made it. There was no attempt at forcing an international cast, forcing a higher profile cast, at making the story easier to understand for an American public. It was left to us to make the film we wanted to make. Whether we have succeeded in its entirety is not the point.
Certainly wouldn't it be left to you now?
Today, it would be much more expensive to make the same film. And I think, therefore, it would be more difficult to resist those pressures, and maybe one would be dealing with executives not as enlightened as Lindsay Law proved to be then, in allowing the free rein to the filmmakers to make what they were trying to make.
There's always been a problem in funding filmmaking in Britain, and the problem is very simple, really. Britain doesn't return enough money from its cinemas to make a film that's only shown in Britain wholly successful. And so British films have always looked across the Atlantic, or indeed across the Channel, and hoped to have some kind of international distribution, which they only occasionally get. And that's the kind of nub of the problem. And for a long time, the solution to this problem was to basically have a tax on the box office, which was known originally as the Eady levy. It was introduced in the 1940s, just after the war, and it was similar to schemes that operate right across Europe, where what it comes down to is taxing the revenues from American films, because they, of course, take the lion's share of the box office, feeding that back into a national film fund of some kind, and then giving it to the local producers. And that Eady levy system of taxing box office admission income worked very well for a period of time, and actually sustained British cinema, such as it was during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. But as cinema attendances dropped, and as the theatre owners very successfully lobbied to bring it to an end, we reached a point in the 1980s when the Thatcher government said, right, that's it. We're pulling the rug. There is no more support system. There's not going to be any policy on film. In fact, the Thatcher government's policy was to have no policy on cinema, to say it's just another industry, let it take its chances, let's see if it sinks or swims. Now that's very out of step with the rest of Europe, which was busy propping up its national cinema, thinking it's really important to have, French cinema in France and German cinema in Germany, but the Thatcher government seemed really not to care. And only Channel 4 television, to a certain extent BBC television, really fulfilled that role.
Channel 4 had been set up in the early 80s, and Isaacs, the first chief executive, had said very early on that he was going to use 10% of its revenues to revivify British cinema. And in particular, and this was the crucial thing, he was going to negotiate agreements which would allow films to be shown first in the cinema before they were shown on television. That seems so obvious now, but actually all of Ken Loach's films, all of Stephen Frears's films, actually most of what we think of the most interesting films of the 60s and 70s were made for television.
One of the very first films that Channel 4 produced was called Angel, made by Neil Jordan, who was a writer at that time. He was a novelist. And I saw the film in Edinburgh at the festival with Steve Woolley, who was then an exhibitor, later to become a producer. And we thought, this is a fantastic film. We could do something with this in the cinema. But the problem was it was due to go on television in a matter of months. So we had to go along to Channel 4 and say, excuse me, you just made this wonderful film. We want you to take it out of the schedules, put it into the cinemas, and it'll get a lot of critical attention. And when you eventually show it on television, it'll be a much bigger deal. They weren't happy with that. They put a lot of money into the film. They 100% financed it. And they hoped to have it ready to show, to kick off their new series. But we eventually won. The film went into the cinema. It got fantastic press reviews. And I think you could say that Neil Jordan's career as a filmmaker began with that tremendous response to Angel. Now, had that not gone into the cinema, things might not have been so easy.
By 1990, there'd been a recession, or a recession was kicking in, and no British films were registering at the box office. No one was going to see a British movie anymore. So the whole point of the channel of making films, which was seen in cinemas, attracting a lot of attention, and then get shown on the channel with all the attendant publicity and noise and critical acclaim that these films might have received by their cinema release, was not working anymore. They weren't getting into cinemas, and when they weren't making any impact. So they said, well, there's no energy left here. Why that was, I had no idea. I mean, all I knew is when I looked around, I saw there was a lot of talent around, and I was able to. I was a very lucky man. I was around at a time when there was all these people desperate to make films at a price that we could afford to make them for.
So Channel 4 cut through that and basically said, here is a way in which your UK TV license budget is part of your production budget for making a British film. And actually, very often they gave more than a UK TV license. Very often they invested as well. That completely transformed the field, and in particular, what you saw were young companies, of which Palace and Working Title would be the most obvious examples, who would put Working Title's money together, perhaps with a bit of British Screen's money, and some kind of American distribution advance, and would use that to make a £1 to £2 million movie.
We had started out as a distribution company, distributing films, many films by first-time filmmakers, but also and films from filmmakers around the world. We were marketing them very aggressively and with a lot of what's called today guerrilla marketing. We were giving them a high profile and finding audiences for them, and it became natural for us to start production as well. So we already in that way had a kind of, I think I said mini, but much more a micro studio setup where we had our own ability to produce, we had distribution, we had our own retail outlets in terms of video rental stores, we had post-production. We're able to look after the development, production and distribution of our films as a sort of micro studio, and it was hands-on distribution that we had. We were both competing with and allies of bigger organisations. At that time, one of the biggest influences in British film was a new TV company called Channel 4. Their film arm was subsequently called Film 4, but it was Channel 4 to us. They both cooperated with us and invested with us in many films, including Company of Wolves, including Mona Lisa.
It is a fact that a British film was like a dirty word, or a dirty expression. And in the early days, we went out of our way to sort of camouflage the fact that it was British. And to the point where a film like Four Weddings and a Funeral, we knew had a much better chance of success in the UK if it was first released in America. And it was actually advertised in the UK as America's latest comedy hit. That's how we sold it to the Brits.
You could actually put together a first film and a number of films were done like this, calling on the Arts Council, BFI Production, British Screen Finance, Channel 4, Film 4, and possibly a regional fund or two. And so films like Beautiful People and Under the Skin were financed with combinations of money rather like that.
Under the Skin, which was released the same year as The Full Monty in 1997, was a very low budget, very personal film by Carrie Nadler, who had just made a short for the British Film Institute with Catherine Cartledge, and was beginning to explore a whole area of women's psychological reality.
At that time, the head of production, Ben Gibson, and the head of development, Eliza Mellor, decided that they wanted the BFI to address the fact that the majority of films that the BFI had been funding had been written and directed by men. And so they decided that year, I think by this point we're in 95, to dedicate the development slate to women writers and directors. So it was good timing in terms of Karen having an idea that she wanted to pitch for a feature.
I was able to do it then because the head at then, Ben, said, you know, I want you to pursue the themes you developed in Fever, and he really encouraged that rather brave on his part, and I think on my part and on everyone involved, a pursuit of that type of filmmaking.
It was a film which, in a way, was supposed to launch a filmmaker around the festival circuit, and was capable of doing that, certainly. And it was Carrie Nadler focusing on the thing that she can see very clearly, which is a kind of strange, internal, predatory female world.
I was always interested in doing this sort of very complex central female characters because I had been trained as an actress, and actresses often complain, oh, there are no films, men get all the complex, difficult roles. So I really wanted to do complex, difficult anti-heroines. And sexuality is one area. You know, not a lot of women rob banks. I mean, you do get them, but you know, that kind of aggressive sexuality I thought was really interesting and hadn't been shown a lot. And that kind of addiction for a kind of promiscuity.
BFI production really had a cultural remit, and it seemed to me a good deal of freedom to follow its nose, which meant that the ability to get closely involved with unlikely projects and to bring them through meant that exceptional films could be made.
The history since the film Monty has been an uneven one, of course. More British films have got made, it's true, but it's also true that it's been a very up and down, a very sort of rocky path. The report, the bigger picture that followed the film Monty, led to the creation of the UK Film Council. So now Britain has got, very much as in other parts of Europe, a national body that's trying to coordinate the whole film industry and really make all the pieces work together. And that has got to be progress. And that's putting a lot of money into developing training, trying to develop distribution, trying to really make it a more competitive industry.
When films like Trainspotting, Full Monty, Four Weddings came out, they had such an extraordinary success, those films, that in some ways it was very inspiring for us, because to a greater or lesser extent they really are British stories. But at the same time, I think the success of those films led people to look perhaps for something that would work with the in the USA, to look for something that would really push the commercial buttons. And so you got a tendency for films that weren't like that to be a little bit marginalised. So I don't think they in one fell swoop destroyed anything, but I think they perhaps contributed to a sense, a kind of new orthodoxy about what a good British film could be. And you know, for my money, orthodoxy shouldn't rule the roost.
I was at Miramax, I was head of production at Miramax at the time when the Full Monty came into us. We liked the script very much. I remember Treya Hoving in acquisition saying we should definitely take this film seriously. But we read it as a piece of social realism and didn't, even though it was definitely funny, we didn't see the comedy kind of transcending its social realist roots. And we got it wrong, Fox got it right.
I think everybody should own up to their own lack of foresight of various kinds. I mean, I remember that we were in the Sundance Film Festival that year, and I remember the film being there. I think that a lot of people, even when the film was there, before they'd actually seen it, kind of worried that, okay, this was something which is essentially a kind of Ealing comedy plot dealing with a political situation, and that it was going to be pursued at that level. I know that in the end it sort of fell foul of the British funding system, partly because it was well plotted.
Seeking commercial success for commercial success's sake in the UK is a very, very difficult thing to do. That most of the small films that have come out of the UK and gone ballistic, gone big, Four Weddings and a Funeral, Full Monty, more recently Bend It Like Beckham. The fact that they were successful is in a sense more down to luck and just striking a particular tone at a particular time than judgment.
The only way to make indigenous film industries really effective in the world market is, and indeed in the UK market, is to make something that is distinctive and different from what other companies and other countries are producing. It's no good competing and thinking we can take on the Americans and make films as commercially successful as them. We can't. We don't have the resources. We don't have the worldwide networks. What we can do is make films which they can't make. But when they see them, they often embrace them and love them because they are so different and delightful.
It's very interesting that you actually can't make films to a formula, and all attempts to apply the formula of the full Monty to subsequent films, I think, have failed.
You know, I think one of the things they don't look at is if you trust the passion, the intensity of the filmmakers, you tend to get something really interesting. And I think one of the areas I would look at is why is it that the financiers, sometimes I feel, don't trust film itself. You know, that the people who love film and trust the medium should be trusted more. And I think that very often the people involved in giving out the money maybe haven't got that real love and affection for film. What they love and have affection for is their jobs, and terrified of not making a hit film, and that's always a recipe very often for blandness.
The criteria that people use to make their financing decisions have shrunk and become more conservative, you know, mitigating against things like first-time directors and more unusual projects or no-name casts and stuff like that.
It has to be said, I think we're living through an era of spectacularly dull and boring cinema, but you never know what's just one's personal taste and what is, you know, the moment of the times.
If you look at the range of work that people like Danny Boyle or Michael Winterbottom have done, you know, it really moves between the genres and defies that. And I think one of the good things is that in terms of British cinema now, you know, you've got films like Shaun of the Dead, which is a great piece of comedy pastiche.
I think it's absolutely possible to make a visionary and distinctive and independent film in the financing climate right now. I would give up if I didn't think that. I remain an optimist.
And you know, I think there are actually many creative strands at work in Britain which are going to produce some more great movies over the next few years.
What is successful British film, people say? Some will argue that we just need cultural success, critical success, cinephile success. Others will argue that that's all a load of tosh and what we really need is box office success. The answer, as always, is we need both. We're not really capable of making sustained box office success, certainly not at a level that Hollywood does. We're not an unsuccessful business, but we're not a particularly financially viable business, so we need also a big cultural element. So the fact that we're not having box office successes does not mean we should stop making films. We need films that reflect our culture, that are a document of our culture, that are inspirational, that are investigative, that question things. On the other hand, it's a bit sad if we can't get many people to see them. So we also need to have box office hits, or at least sort of DVD and TV hits and films that stay on the shelf, so that people, both of this generation and future generations, will actually think they're worth watching.